COVID, I graduated in like 2019, and then I moved to China to like teach English over there, and then I had to come back because of COVID. And during that whole period of having to come back and going through COVID here, I kind of like took like a deep dive when it came into, I guess, consciousness, African consciousness, and just learning more about myself, where I'm from, etc. And I think it was during that period that I learned about this, as well as many other things.
I would say my late teens, early 20s, I started, because I think understanding the Berlin Conference has been like a long period of time for me, because when you first engage it, it's like, I think because I studied law in university, it was something that was like mentioned, and it wasn't even a part of the classes, it was just something that was mentioned in passing. I was like, oh, what is that? Did a little bit of research, understood that, okay, it's dividing borders in Africa, but I never went too deep into it until, I guess, recently, when I was like, oh, okay, let's have a better understanding of what is going on and how it then affected us. But for me, it's an ongoing learning process that started in my late teens.
It's really interesting. I think for me, I was probably like 10, but it's because my dad was a history teacher, and he used to teach history in Zimbabwe, and he made it a point for us to learn African history. But I think it's quite interesting that quite a lot of us young people in the diaspora, we learn about, especially the Berlin Conference and African history, quite later on, out of our own interests and out of our own kind of studies. And I think if we're talking about beyond the Berlin Conference, we have to also think about how are we educating and creating spaces where we can educate young people, our generation, our kids and our grandkids, because we can't achieve Sankofa if we don't know that history. But then how are we making that history accessible?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you just define young person as you see it? Like, what are the age ranges?
Yeah, so for us,
I think it's useful context.
yeah, that's a good question. So when we say young people, we're talking 18 to 35, and that's also the age range that we work with within our activities at the Conference.
Join us.
Okay, so
but obviously youth is mainly in the mind.
So how does? Well, you don't have to.
Yeah, I was gonna add. I think it's really good that your dad taught you that from such a young age, because I'm Nigerian, and I know that in Nigerian school curriculums, like history has been completely erased from the curriculum because there's so much of a push to on like STEM and like engineering and whatnot. And I have like friends that live in Nigeria that say like, yeah, we don't learn about like Nigerian history. Maybe that's changing just about like now, but I think it's crazy that like there's almost been an intentional erasure of like African history from like the curriculum, which is really sad.
And I think there's things that everyone in this room can do, and I think we have to also think about what are we creating to change that. And I've got some questions on that later. So then how does learning about the Berlin Conference and its legacies affect how you understand your own identity? That's an open question for anyone in the panel. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first. I think for me, it's just realizing that Nigeria doesn't really exist. It's just a social construct, and it pushed me to kind of learn more about my own history as an Igbo person, and just learning, I mean, beyond like the Biafran War, like before that, just learning about pre-colonial Africa and learning all of these things that we think are African but aren't really African, if that makes sense. So like, for example, even learning about gender relations in pre-colonial Africa, I learned that when I was doing reading, I learned that women were involved in trade, were involved in commerce. As we just learned, women were actually given responsibility of poverty prevention, whereas I feel like Western narratives would have us think that Africa wasn't as progressive when it came to gender, whereas we were actually a lot more progressive when it came to gender equality and gender relations than Westerners. And then when they colonized us, they brought along their own Victorian, very, sexist ideals, and then pushed that onto us through, religion and Christianity. And then now they basically make it seem like, oh well, we're so backwards because they've advanced. So just kind of realizing that African countries are so young, and we have been, our whole psyche, our whole way of life has been almost disrupted, and now we're almost having to like pick up the pieces, and we're kind of having to learn from them apparently what progressiveness looks like, what gender equality looks like. And it's crazy to think that, because it's like we had a lot of respect for women in African societies, more than they had at the time where they brought over their own religion. So yeah, I think that's kind of what the Berlin Wars taught me. It's just really learning that there was a whole way of life that I will never know, because it looks so different from the Africa we know now, and I guess the onus unfortunately is on us to try and learn what that looked like before. And that's not to say that everything before was perfect, because there were practices that we did in pre-colonial Africa that I'm not proud of. For example, certain societies killed twins, for example, and colonization changed that. So it's not that everything is perfect, but it's about, like you said, learning what it looks like, almost trying to like think, okay, what is it that we can bring back? What is it that we don't want to bring back? And then how can we use this information about who we are to shape how we go forward? Yeah.
I'm gonna say, I think for me personally, learning about the Berlin Conference hasn't had like an effect on how I personally think, only because I guess during the timeline of when it actually happened, obviously slavery was well on the way by then. And as someone that was born in the Caribbean, although I am African, I don't know what my African roots are. And so how it's more affected me is just being able to have empathy for how things are today, and just learning more about it and being more conscious about the powers that are at play, and how things just led up to what they are.
I do agree with what you both said, and I do agree also with the fact that African countries are so young, especially when you take into consideration all the things that's happened, like when colonialism did start, from the Berlin Conference when they divided up the borders, then when they decided that, oh, we're going to abolish it in, I think, 1807, and they're like, okay, well, just because you've set the law for it to be abolished doesn't mean that the practices and what's already started is going to end right away. So we really only started trying to take some type of control in like the late 1990s, or like the late 1900s, which I think learning about the Berlin Conference just made me want to give a bit more grace to how things are going, because so often we hear like, oh, why is it that Africa's not progressed yet? Why have we not done this yet? Why have we not done that yet? Other countries are able to turn things around in like 20 years, are able to get things done within the last 100 when they're in similar situations as us, but understanding that how everything even happened is extremely systematic, and even though those systems are still in place, and it's going to take quite a lot to then unmove what's been done to then set a new foundation. Grace has to be given to the continent. It's just not fair to just assume that they can just magically within a day fix everything. As you mentioned with Sankofa, like you need to look back to then fix whatever you want to do, well, to progress whatever you want to do in the future. And that is a part of looking back. What laws have been put in place? What systems have they put in place? What procedures are still being done? Looking at the education system, what is it that we're not learning? Does it need to be learned? Do we need to understand our history properly? Of course, I agree, we do. And I think coming from an African Caribbean background, I'm Jamaican and Liberian, we weren't colonized in the same way that the other countries were. Liberia was deemed a US territory, so they just thought, okay, this is not really up for grabs. But we had a different type of way in which we were colonialized, I guess, the changes in which the way that we live, because African Americans came from the US, settled in Liberia, and then started pushing these westernized ideologies onto us, which is different from how other countries may have experienced their own colonialism, and we still struggle with that strife today. So definitely taking a look at our back in our past and understanding for each country what's going on and how we can fix it.
I think one of the things that I did last year, which has really helped me to expand my own knowledge, was I did a course with the School of Pan-African Studies all about learning about the African history, as well as a Pan-African course. And something that was so intriguing to me was learning about all the different kingdoms that existed on the continent, all of the different ways in which leadership, authority, even things like making decisions. In some different kingdoms, it wouldn't just be one person. It would actually be a communion, a union, who would decide, okay, how do we, as a people, decide what we actually want? So it's like just expanding our understanding in that way, for me, helped me realize that actually a lot of the ideas and images that I would see growing up off the continent, even though I was born in Zimbabwe, raised here in the UK, I was like, wow, there is so much more things that we need to actually understand about what we used to do. That some of these negative portrayals of the continent in media, in music, in movies, even some that our generation also still think about the continent because they haven't maybe had that engagement, also asks us to travel and go out and actually see more of the continent itself and actually educate ourselves in those ways too. But I'll come to that. And I wanted to actually to say, one of the things that's quite interesting to understand, and I know that, yes, we're talking about young people and young Africans in their story, we're not a monolith. It's very much, so much difference. Do you feel that we have inherited maybe any psychological or emotional borders? If so, what do you think they are and how do you see them showing up? And this could just even be just from your own lived experience or from your own conversations with your friends and family.
Yes. But I'll let someone else go because I can ramble about this for ages.
I do think it's like a very broad question because borders, like for example in the diaspora, like being here in the UK has a different experience to how it'd be like growing up back home, which I think creates a different type of border because then experiences growing up as a Black British person, which is essentially forging their own identity, being Black British. How does that look like? Then that in itself has its own borders because Black British, you're from African descent, from Caribbean descent, then there's those who are like a bit of both. How does that look like? What type of borders does that create? So I think I don't know how to narrow down that question. So.
I think I would say when it comes to psychological or emotional borders, one of the things that I would think maybe it exacerbated would be because before the Berlin Conference, they already sought to, I guess, separate our collective consciousness and our way of thinking as a people by just making us more like individual, like, you know, separating the community, the family, all that kind of stuff. And I think maybe one of the effects of the conference that we still see today, because we don't really move as a people that's united, whether that's on the continent, in the Caribbean, in South America. And yes, I think it's just given us a different sense of self that we originally had. And yeah, we just don't really, I guess the care and the love has kind of shifted a little bit. And then you can see it in, I guess, our family structures, our youth, just generally how we behave as a people. Obviously not all of us, but just general things that I've noticed growing up. And when I look into history, it seems like things were a lot different to how they are now. It's like the gentleman that was speaking before touched on that we don't have a lot of wars, and you know, our general way of living and associating with each other was very different to how it looks now. And I think that is part of the psychological and emotional effect, because although we're technically free, we're still spiritually enslaved, and I think that's literally one of the biggest things that we're going through as a people at the moment.
That's a really good point. I feel like there's borders, when you refer to like psychological borders, it's like there's so many different borders that we can like touch on. There's borders, for example, between Africans and Caribbeans in the UK. Thankfully, that's like changing gradually. But once upon a time, like not even that long ago, like 10 years ago, there was always so much. There were always so many tensions between the African community and Caribbean community, and you know, part of it is like what our parents would teach us. Like, you know, I know, like for example, as a Nigerian, like, you know, I have friends whose parents would be like, don't marry a Jamaican. And then, you know, I know, like, you know, Caribbeans would have their own, you know, oh, like, you're African, you're not as, your hair's not as, you know, soft or whatever. In secondary school, it was kind of difficult, not for me personally, because I went to like a very African school, but my siblings, they were in a school with like loads of Africans and Caribbeans, and I feel like their generation, maybe 5 years older than me, so like the early 30s, they were not as proud to be African then, because there was that idea of like, we are more primitive in comparison to Caribbeans, or we don't, you know, even colorism as well, like what does an African look like versus what a Caribbean looks like. So there was a lot there in terms of the borders that we created for ourselves, which is unfortunate. But then there's even, like you said, like just individual borders in the sense of how individualistic we are. And I think that speaks to us trying to replicate Western individualism and put it on a pedestal. And even things like, for example, Black excellence. Like, I have some issues sometimes with the phrase Black excellence because it depends on how it's used. But sometimes when we look at, for example, America, when we praise like Black billionaires in America, like, you know, oh, Rihanna's a billionaire, da 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 da, I feel like sometimes we are replicating the idea that like the be-all end-all of life is to pursue monetary success, whereas in Africa, in pre-colonial Africa, the be-all end-all of life was community. Like that was the prize. You know, the prize wasn't to be the wealthiest person, because what is wealth without the community? So I think we have those borders that we've created for ourselves because we think that that's what we should be doing. Racism has taught us that's what the be-all end-all is. But it's sad because I think we need to kind of reframe how we look at life and think, okay, no, this is actually what's important. Like, we are nothing if we don't succeed together. You know, that collectivism, I think, is something that we've really lost over the decades.
I will also open up for the floor in a few minutes.